Welcome to Let's Talk Wellness, where we will be sharing insights into the world of mental health and wellness as we explore traditional medicine and holistic healing options. It's time to have new conversations about mental health. Join Mara James, the founder and CEO of the Hugs for Life Healing Center, as she guides us along this journey. And now, let's talk wellness.
Welcome to Let's Talk Wellness. I'm your host, Mara James, and I'm excited to introduce you today to an amazing licensed educational and school psychologist, Dr. Jordana Levine.
Hi, thanks for having me, Mara.
It's so great to see you here. So if you could share with our friends listening and watching a little bit about your background.
I have my doctorate in school and clinical psychology, and I got that, about 16, 17 years ago. And I have always loved working with children, and I've just done that, I guess, my whole adult life, worked with children, from kids with autism and kids in hospitals and kids in schools. And but as the years went on, I ended up specializing in kids with dyslexia, learning disorders, and executive functioning issues, and ADHD.
Wow, so it's just something that you were drawn to.
Yes, it was something I was always drawn to.
So that is beautiful. And you're originally where from?
Well, I was born in New York, and I was pretty much raised in Massachusetts, and my family and I moved from Connecticut, and kind of a suburb of New York, about 4 or 5 years ago to California, and so here I am.
Beautiful. And then that's where we met, through a mutual friend.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's
exactly.
on the Talk Children's. Amazing. So gosh, we have so much to talk about. And I know so many people out there have questions. Where do you want to start? Dyslexia, ADHD, executive functioning?
Oh my gosh. Why don't we start with learning disorders, dyslexia?
Awesome. Go for it. What can tell us? Everything and anything that a parent would want to know, need to know, your guidance, your advice.
Well, I think that the most important piece about dyslexia is that it should be a surprise, in terms of, you have a typically developing kid who's bright and who seems to be able to keep up, but why can't they, acquire letters and sounds? So it's a surprise that they're not reading well, or reading fluently, or understanding what they're reading or what they should be doing. And I think that's kind of a misconception about dyslexia in particular, and learning disorders in general, that people aren't smart, that they're not good enough, or that there's something wrong with them. That's not true at all. You can be dyslexic and be brilliant. You can have a math disorder and be brilliant. And actually, typically, what you see with kids and adults who have diagnosed learning disabilities or undiagnosed learning disabilities also, is that they're super creative, is that there is a major creative side to these kids and adults, because they have to use other parts of their brain to learn, and it just things develop in different ways. So and then one thing about specifically dyslexia, which is also called a reading disorder, and I think there's more acceptance of dyslexia now, and there's actually more legislation in all of the states to incorporate dyslexia as a true disability. And what they're finding, and there's lots of research going on, and research in all places, in schools and universities, but that if you have a first-degree relative, you have a 50% chance, a first-degree relative with dyslexia, you have a 50% chance of having dyslexia yourself. And so it's deeply genetic. It is, and I think that's important for parents to know that as their kids are developing, that If you yourself have a learning disability, your child has a very strong chance of having that, and working on it early, like most things, is the best solution, and getting to it early, so kids don't experience failure in school or feeling ostracized, or just feeling, unfortunately, just dumb, which they're, not. So
No, and they have a superpower, which I love. And I always say, the greater the challenge, the greater the gift.
mhm.
What age, if it's a professional, what age can you generally, is it usually revealed? Obviously, especially if it's a parent, their first child, they don't know anything. I mean, that to compare it to.
Absolutely.
So like, is this like something that the school will see and they'll talk to the parents about, and, to refer to us like someone like you?
Well, typically schools will refer within themselves to their own school psychologist, and I have worked in schools where that's what I do. And there are different states have different rules about how they approach it. So it's really on a state by state basis in public school. And there is a difference between a dyslexic kid in public school versus a dyslexic kid in an independent school setting. But typically, with some kinds of, there are different kinds of dyslexia, but typically at a young age, I think one of the things that parents can know is that kids typically don't rhyme well. So they can't rhyme pig and dig, or, kind of on the spot or in games, that it just kind of eludes them, that they don't hear the sounds the same way other people do. And that's kind of a red flag early on. Preschools do rhyming games. They do, during circle time, they do it in kindergarten. And that's kind of a first, I believe it's like a first thing, and kind of some other things like not being able to label your colors or remember your colors or remember the order of numbers. Those are all kind of swirling things. It could be a learning disorder, or it could not be. Kids develop at different times, and that's why a lot of schools, as well as clinicians, are very reluctant to diagnose young children. But it's important, those red flags, if they're persistent, and the kid is not learning, the child is not learning those kind of building blocks and basics, that's when those red flags they should be more glaring. And I really believe the rhyming one, the rhyming one is a big one, because it really goes into the sounds of dyslexia.
And does that, oh my gosh, I could just imagine me years ago, like being this neurotic mother, like, what rhymes with this? So is it literally asking your child what rhymes with pig, what rhymes with
or
that?
like, how there are lots of games that they play where you're like, need to, and sing songs, sometimes doing it in songs. And some kids are just stumped. They just don't hear it. And it's really surprising for a lot of adults to be like, oh my goodness, they really are stumped by this. They can't, they don't hear, or they don't see, or it just mystifies them. So it's, I think, yes, you could drill your kid and be like, what rhymes with cat? But I think like kind of pulling out some songs and like doing like rhyming sentences and stuff like that, then you start really seeing at whether is the child under the gun to rhyme, or is it like, are they just organically not able to come up with that rhyme?
So if it's like hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock, would a parent ask the teacher to repeat it or to read it?
Well, it's like that becomes a song. And so like hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. And you say, oh my goodness, what else rhymes with clock? Or what else rhymes with, dock? You know what I mean? And even if it's a made up word, they can say pock, or, well, I keep on coming up with sock and but like there are other things once the teacher kind of teaches it, and then they try to apply it to other things, because also students with learning disabilities are usually very good at recognizing where they're deficient. So they will instantly memorize something like that, because they don't want to be called out, especially as they get older. So they memorize things, and even though they don't understand the foundational aspect of it, and kind of the organic way it should come out.
Sure. And then what happens once a child is identified that it's hard to rhyme or might have dyslexia? What
Well,
then?
I mean, there are early dyslexia screenings available. And, I'm a big proponent of the early dyslexia screening because oftentimes you can correct things, especially mild cases of dyslexia, you can really correct them early with in school reading programs. Maybe an in-school, what we like to call kind of like a double dose of the reading instruction. So they get it once in the day and then they get it a second time to reinforce it of the same reading program. It's not like a whole new, but that can help some kids so that they don't experience things. It doesn't get worse, and some of it is caught sometimes. And then some kids need much more intensive instruction, and there are intensive and there are tutoring programs, one-on-one tutoring programs, and there are that are systematic and very direct instruction that have then the multi-sensory instruction. So there's physical movement, there's touching, there's listening, there's reading. So it's a very well-known, well-researched programs out there, and there are other centers that kind of adopt those kind of multisensory programs and do good work. And that's just kind of teaching the mechanics of reading, to read fluently and to read without pause and to be able to read for meaning, which is comprehension. To be able to, that's one thing to just read. It's another thing to comprehend what you're reading and be able to ask questions about it. And so there's that kind of like fluency and comprehension aspect of reading.
Right. And it's amazing. My husband's brother is dyslexic and he's a successful OBGYN.
Absolutely.
So, and
Absolutely.
at his age also to be, they didn't have tools then, 40, 50 something years ago. So in his 40s, like they do now. So,
well, and I think that's one of the things is that that highlights an example of how, largely individuals who are dyslexic have great strengths in other areas, and they compensate for those the deficits that they do have and find other ways. And there's been research to show and to highlight that your neural pathways change as people who are diagnosed with dyslexia. They use different parts of their brain than typical readers do. And to get to the same point, they have to use a different part of their brain. And that's well documented.
Right. And then so some of the kids stay in their regular class versus going to a specialized class or a specialized school.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in many cases, a student with dyslexia is still able to learn history, is able to learn math, and is able, it has nothing to do with their intellect. It's really just kind of a neurobiological basis of their wiring. It's just not connecting in the way that it does for typical readers, and I'm not a scholar on the history of neurobiology, but I certainly do know that we're biologically wired to talk. We're not biologically wired to read. Wow. And that is a newer invention of the last few hundred years to read. We are wired to talk. So when there's a disconnect, it doesn't come as easily for some people.
That is profound. I've never heard about that. And it makes me have so many questions, which I'm not even going to go into now. Wow. Like the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. If we're not supposed to read, why was
it was originally spoken. It was we have lots of oral histories, and so oral history was the majority of the way we learned and people learn things. And when you talk about like the printing press, again, I am not a scholar on this, but it's it's less than 500 years ago that books started to be printed.
I never knew that. And then you have the
which makes sense though.
Yeah. But then you have the 10 commandments that were written. My brain keeps going there. So I'm going
to, no, it's okay.
So interesting.
But it wasn't widely available. So that kind of thing was not widely available.
Not like just Google it on the internet. What were they?
No.
That was not even an idea back then. Amazing. Wow. Okay, anything else you want to share with us about dyslexia? Do parents, would they look for an IEP or 504 for their child, and also
Absolutely.
explaining, because some people might not know what that is. So if you want to explain what
Okay.
those are, and then if you recommend.
Okay. Well, Section 504 is part of the American with Disabilities Act, as far as, if I'm saying everything correctly. And that's really for a medical diagnosis. And just, having a learning disability isn't technically a medical diagnosis. However, having ADHD is a medical diagnosis. So many times, we can get into talking about ADHD in a little bit, but many times students who have ADHD, or even you can, or on other, other illnesses. If you have diabetes, you can have a Section 504, other things. And those just provide accommodations to a child in the school setting. And you have to go through a meeting. It's a lot less intensive of a process, because you really just need a note from your doctor stating you have diabetes or you have ADHD or whatever it is. And then you kind of go to a meeting with the teacher, with the 504 coordinator, and the parent, and you discuss what your child would need in the classroom, and what the teacher sees, what the parents want. And, hopefully everybody sees eye to eye on what was most beneficial for the child. And I would say mostly it's usually, it can be a very, friendly process. Sometimes it does go awry, as I'm sure many people have friends or have experienced it themselves. But in general, that's what a 504 is. It's just to give accommodations, like, for example, for a child with ADHD, maybe in the younger grades, close proximity to the teacher, reminders of reminders of work that is coming up, or maybe something visual, like something visual that they know where the class is, how the class is going to be broken down, so that they have expectations. Sometimes it can be a timer to do your work, that they're given a timer, and some kids can set the timer themselves, some kids can't. It really depends on what the issue is. Now, a little bit more intensive is called an individualized education plan, which is short form is IEP. Now, there's lots of legal, because this is it's a legal document, and an IEP is a legal document, and so there are parameters that schools have to go through. And I'm not gonna, again, I'm not gonna go through every 60 days, 30 days, what the school's responsible for. But in general, a referral needs to be made to the school. And typically that has to be in writing, if not all the time has to be in writing, that they think that there is a learning disability, or they suspect that something is going on with their child, or the teacher can also refer to it within the school. You hope, in an ideal setting, that the teacher and the parents, or both parents, are on the same page and are aware of what's going on, that there are issues, and that they're on the same page to refer this child for testing, for psychoeducational testing in the school. And in some cases, a parent might say, I don't want to do it in the school. I want to go to an outside person. And that's an outside person like me, who would be able to do the same plus more kind of testing. Or, a parent could say, in an independent school, that would be in a public school. In an independent school, they do not provide that, IEP. You have to get an IEP from your home school district. And again, somebody in an independent school could also just go privately if they want, again, outside of the school system. And then they could bring those results to the district. In both cases, they can bring the outside results to the district. And so then after the testing is done, and what it looks like in a public school is typically the school psychologist will speak with the parents, speak with the teachers, interview parents and teachers, as well as ask them to fill out rating scales. The school psychologist will usually, hopefully, go into the classroom and observe the student before they test the student, so that they have some idea of how they perform or behave in the classroom setting before they before they actually do the testing. And then they do the testing for a psychoeducational evaluation, which entails an intelligence test or a cognitive test. And then a teacher in the school system will do a special education teacher will complete an academic test, some academic testing. In the private setting, the psychologist will do the academic testing. And then there are other kinds of testings that they can do, whether it's testing for ADHD or autism rating scales, trying to get a bigger picture of what's going on with the student and trying to get a better understanding of how they learn is really, and what's, and if there's no cognitive issues, which means they're age appropriate in terms of their ability to learn, what else is going on? Is there depression or is there anxiety? Or, oftentimes there's also can be neglect in the family. There can be something else going on at home. There's all these different things. And really, what's the most important thing that I have seen is that in childhood, lots of disorders and lots of disabilities, their symptoms overlap. So it's really important to have good people who are knowledgeable about those kinds of symptoms, because you can, some symptoms of anxiety in children can look the same as ADHD inattentive style or hyperactive impulsive. So it's really important to have an understanding of how to tease out what the diagnosis is, or really in schools, what is hindering access to typical education. And sometimes they find it and sometimes they don't. And sometimes maybe, you want, as a parent, you want the school to give your child the best testing, but legally public schools are only obligated to give what's fair and appropriate. And I think that becomes the bit, parents are very intuitive about their kids. Most parents are, and they say, I know something's not right, even though the testing didn't show this. I know something's not right. And it goes on and on and on. And that's where a lot of the conflict comes at public school.
And so I'm going to ask, don't answer it yet, because we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
And then we're going to come back and ask, of course, like I always like to do, what would you recommend? What would you do for your child? Would you have public versus private, take into account money? And then of course we'll get into one of my, I don't know if it's my favorite topics, but ADHD. So hold on, everybody, and we'll be right back.
In these shifting and changing times, more and more lives are being impacted by mental health. The Extraordinary Lives Foundation, also known as ELF, is transforming the way people view and navigate mental health challenges. Their mission is to improve children's mental health and wellness and support families by providing educational tools, resources, and awareness events. ELF encourages families to recognize symptoms, overcome the stigma, and reach out for help. Through prevention, early intervention, and holistic treatment, we believe many of the big problems facing today's youth can be transformed within a generation. Extraordinary Lives Foundation is excited to offer the Hugs for Life Healing Center, growing a worldwide network of approved holistic healers and bridging the gap between traditional and complementary healing options. Visit the Extraordinary Lives Foundation website at www.elfempowers.org to find out more about their resources and events. Together, we can change the conversation around mental health. We hope that you're enjoying today's Let's Talk Wellness podcast. And if you have a topic that you would like us to explore, we would love to hear from you. Simply email us at info@elfempowers.org. That's info@elfempowers.org. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Wellness. I'm your host, Mara James, and today we have an amazing licensed educational and school psychologist, Dr. Jordana Levine.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. It's our pleasure. And I'm glad that you moved, not that you followed me because we didn't know each other on the East Coast, but it's so good to have an East Coaster out here with me. So the question I left us off with before was about testing for dyslexia. And I know that this is really touchy because some people can afford things and some couldn't. My favorite question, so my husband's patients always ask him, as an OBGYN, what would you do for your daughter? What would you do for your wife? So, Dr. Jordana, what would you do if you saw something for your kids or your nephew or niece? What would you recommend they do for the testing? Where to go, and are the schools good enough?
Well, yes, I understand that. And I think, like in many parts of public education, our teachers, our support staff, our administration, and our special educators, and those are taxed. That is what it is. And again, I want to remind everybody that, our schools are legally bound to do free and appropriate education. It's which is not the best. And you have to keep that in mind. Whatever's appropriate. And that means appropriate that applies to a broad swath of children. Now, I think as parents, you have a right to get involved in your child's testing and understand in the public school. There are wonderful school psychologists and speech therapists and occupational therapists that work in the public school system. I've worked with wonderful, wonderful ones. However, I think they see a lot of children, and I think trying to be as involved in the process and have them walk you through it. You're allowed to ask questions as a parent. You're allowed to understand, why are you referring my child for speech and language testing? Because oftentimes kids with who might not be reading can have an underlying language disorder. They can have, and so oftentimes an initial evaluation in the elementary school age, you will have a speech and language evaluation as part of a full psychoeducational battery. And I think that's the thing, is trying to understand how broad they're taking their initial evaluation of your child, and understand and ask why. Don't be ashamed to ask, why are you doing this? This is your child. They're doing testing on your child. And so I think there's lots of times where you can absolutely trust the process, as long as you feel like there's that reciprocity, and as long as you feel like there's that respect, between the institution that you're dealing with and your family. And I think that's really, really the most important. So depending, and different schools have different levels of that respect and that deep testing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So if it were my child, I think it also depends on the issue. Their schools are very well equipped to deal with reading disorders, and they're well equipped to deal with lots of special education, aspects of special education. But, you want to make sure that you're seeing progress. You want to make sure that your child is learning, and that specifically after testing, if they are found to be part of special education, which is not a dirty word. I have to very much say that special education is not a dirty word. I'm going to give you a little anecdote in a little bit about special education, but you want to make sure that they're learning at the same pace as other students with the help that they get in the school. And when that pace starts to fall off, or if that pace of learning starts to fall off, then that kind of tells you something's not going well. Because if it's simple dyslexia or simple reading disorder, they should also have the supports in the school necessary to learn at the same pace as the others, as the typically functioning children. So it's not a bad idea ever to start with your school. However, going privately will cover a lot more bases earlier on, if that tracks.
So when I was in New York City, I had a girlfriend that did not want to, her son was at a private school and she refused to even, I mean, he was on a spectrum autistic and she did not want it to go like into his, school file. So she did everything privately, which to me, if the child, there shouldn't be any shame in that. And then if they're not going to, I don't want to say label them, but if they're not going to identify it, how can they give him the resources to help him be successful?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and first I want to kind of demystify the idea of the permanent record. There's no such thing as a permanent record. Your kids, kindergarten grades do not go to college with them. Your kids' experience in elementary school don't go to college. They got detention on Tuesday for biting Sally. That's not going to college with them. That's not going on their record to college. And I think that's something really important to understand. And I think what you said is that like you have professionals who are spending, up to 8 hours a day with your child. And if they don't know that your child has a disability, whether it's autism or dyslexia or like you would share diabetes, you would share a traumatic brain injury with the school. Why would you not share something that the school could potentially help with? Or if it's not the right setting for your child because they're unable to provide the support that your child needs. And that, so the idea of the permanent record, for example, I just, you can have testing for your child, and remember, that's also protected information. It's protected health information and is not to be shared with anybody without your permission. So a school, like a high school, cannot send your reports to a college if you're applying to a college unless you say, okay, that's what I want to happen. So this idea that it will stigmatize this child in some way is kind of, a backwards way of thinking. We want to help children, help move them forward so they don't fall behind anymore.
Yeah.
That their disability or, their medical condition doesn't prevent them from falling behind.
That is so profound. Wow. I'm just wowed.
I'm glad.
Yeah. And okay, so let's do a little shift over to ADHD.
Okay.
Not gonna have an ADHD moment, no. But yeah, so what would you like to share with us about that? Because one of my children, with along with his mathematical genius mind comes his challenges. So we have the gift, and then there's a challenge diagnosed with Asperger's and ADHD, and yeah, interesting. So what do you want to share with us about that?
Well, I think just like you're talking about with Asperger's, which is on the autism spectrum, I think ADHD is also kind of, you can understand it along a spectrum, and you can understand like there's real severe cases and there are milder cases. And that there's there's 3 different kinds. There's the inattentive kind, which focuses on intensive. And that, it's important to understand that clinically inattentive children often tend to be overlooked in school because they don't disrupt. They're daydreamers, their mind's out the window, I should say. And because they're not disruptive, they don't get picked up. And those are typically girls. There are boys for sure, but typically girls tend to be more ADHD inattentive. That's not an absolute. There are certainly boys that are. And then the other aspect of ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is the impulsive hyperactive type. And those tend to be the disruptors, there was a great Dennis the Menace cartoon years ago that I used to show parents, where it's this picture of Dennis the Menace, and he's like, I've already done this before I even thought about it. I've already, he's already completed it. He didn't even think about it. So it's like, touching a hot stove, or, they're just impulsive. There's no thought that goes into some of the behavior. They just do before they think. And then The third kind is really the combined type, which the inattentive plus the hyperactive impulsive. And then that together is kind of like the big part of ADHD. And yes.
Go on.
No. Were you going to ask a question?
Yeah. So for the second one where they do without thinking, is there hope? But in addition
Absolutely.
to medication disorder. Yeah.
Well, so absolutely. So oftentimes with both kinds and the combined type, the research shows, the research that I was trained on shows that medication does a good job, but also behavioral therapy does a good job, and together they do the best job. So really, it's about and also, just as a side note, and I think this is just common sense with children, good sleeping habits, good eating, really good nutrition and stability and predictable routines. Those are all beneficial to all children, but particularly for children with ADHD. So yes, the medication and the behavioral therapy work, but having all that other stuff in the background, is really going to give the best outcomes. And so again, with, in school, it's a teacher with clear boundaries, a teacher who has clear expectations and helps a child move through the day if they need reminders, or if they need, sometimes a child just needs a quick tap on the desk to refocus, as the teacher walks by, or says, little Johnny, we're going to talk about elephants today. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you, what your favorite, thing that an elephant does. And so that gives Johnny some time to think about what he's going to say. And so they have this, who's inattentive and so they're not just belting something out, you give them a little bit of time. Now, you don't give them too much time because they might forget that they were supposed to think about something. But, those are little strategies in the classroom for younger kids, obviously. But it can also be good for older kids in high school, where the chemistry teacher, pulls Matthew up to the front of the room and says at the beginning of class, or sends Matthew an email the night before, this is what we're going to be talking about in math. And I'm going to ask you to do a problem on the board, or I'm going to ask you to explain a problem or something, knowing that they're capable of doing the problem. So why don't you work it out tonight so that you can have success tomorrow? There are things you can do that showcases how these kids are just as bright as other things. They just have some other things interfering with what I like to say, getting your smart out, just like they're smart, but they just can't get it out.
I love that, getting your smart out. And this is the first time I've ever heard of, and this is just me though, about doing therapy for ADHD. Is this something that's been around for 20 years?
It's behavior therapy. It's behavior therapy. It's like teaching kids what they should do when, that there's, a consequence to your behavior. If you do this, this is going to happen. So what can you do to not do this, this thing, and it just, and basically you put all of these kind of external, what did we used to like to call it? No, they're not external. It's like a scaffolding. When you think about building a building, when you build a building, you have all the, and because you've been in New York City, you see all the, and you have to walk underneath all the scaffolding that supports the building of the building. When the building's built, you remove the scaffolding, and so in that sense, it's the same thing for kids with reading disorders or kids with ADHD. Is like you put all these external supports, so eventually they internalize that support, and as they mature, they can do it on their own. They don't need somebody telling you what to do, or they don't need some reminders, or they don't, they've learned how to take those external supports and turn them into the way it works best for them inside of them to be successful.
Right. And where do you come in this process? Do you do testing yourself?
Yes.
Do you work with treatment aspects?
Well, I've done it all in my career. I've done counseling and therapy and testing and worked in hospitals and psychiatric hospitals, regular outpatient hospitals. I've done all of that. With kids, specifically with kids and some adults along the way, but mostly with kids. And I like the kids the best. However, but my specialty and what I really like to do the most is testing, and testing from a young age. And I can do adult testing as long as it's related to education, some education, because that's where my specialty is. And I'm not doing therapy or counseling currently, but never say never. I'm in a new state. Things
Exactly.
are, I'm open to all things, but and I'd like to be able to go. I think there's some real value in working with preschools and doing early screeners to kind of just get a sense so that parents and schools know, again, going back to what I was saying, specifically for reading, that kind of double dosing, who's at risk, who might need a little push. That might be all they need. That might be all they
Sure.
need. So why wouldn't you screen?
Yeah.
Early on.
Right. And I'm having an idea pop in my head about Piggy Bear's power of, rhyming and,
Yeah.
to help. Like, why not? Because the sooner we can be more proactive, that's so funny.
Absolutely. And just on that about you, just going back to one of the questions that you had about when to know this stuff. A lot of times, and it's well within the school's purview, is that typically in typical schools, all of our kids are learning to read. They spend kindergarten, first, second grade learning to read, and that's the focus. It's learning to read. And third grade is a big shift. Third grade is reading to learn. Mm-hmm. So if your reading isn't up to speed by the time you hit third grade, you're going to struggle to learn from your reading. So a lot of times in schools, that's when it gets picked up. Gotcha. But there are earlier signs, is what I'm saying. And that, to me, is the important piece. There are earlier signs.
Amazing. And I thought I knew it all. Wow. With my 20. Yeah. And I don't mean that. Yeah. And what is the best way for our friends out there to get in touch with you?
Well, I have a practice called Levine Assessment and Learning, and I'm in Newport Beach, and I have a website called, you can get in touch with me through my website, just through the contact or the phone number on the website. There's like a little contact button, and it's called levineassessmentandlearning.com.
Levine, Levine,
assessmentandlearning.com, or levineassessment.com. Right. Okay. Yeah. I'll give it to you.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. And are you on social media at all?
No, I'm not. Not yet. I just started my practice.
Let me tell you what, right. It was such a following because you're such a wealth of information. Dr. Jordana, it's been such a pleasure having you today.
Thank you for having me.
And to all of our friends watching and listening, and to you, never forget that you are amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I had a really wonderful time talking with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Wellness. This podcast has been brought to you by the Hugs for Life Healing Center, a division of the Extraordinary Lives Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. If you would like to listen to more conversations like this, we invite you to subscribe to our mailing list at www.elfempowers.org to be notified when our weekly episodes are published. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you our next conversation on Let's Talk Wellness.